I won't repeat all of last night's talk, but in brief, there's a fascinating romance with or recovery of or advocation of the thought of Thomas Aquinas among many of my circles in the U.S., really evangelicalism in the States, and I'm fascinated by it. I've taught theology for about 25 years, a quarter century, and have generally taught what we would call classical theism, the omnis and immutability and passibility, God's atemporality, etc. Never particularly explicitly or intentionally linked it to Thomism as a system. And so this is intriguing for me, kind of mid-career, two-thirds career, whatever, to see this development. And so last year, I suggested doing a couple talks for another organization, and now this here at Newton House, just so I could force myself to think through these issues and to wrestle with these things. So, covered the backdrop last night, and what I want to do today, instead of doing a 60-minute race through all the thought of Thomas, which would be really impossible, I originally had 5 themes I wanted to hit and wrote about 50 plus pages of notes. I have now reduced that to about 28 pages, and you've got 18 of those in front of you. And I've taken those 5 themes and reduced them to really 2 that I want to discuss today. I'm going to skip a broad schema in the notes for time's sake. But so number 2 and 3 in your notes there, the first theme, anthropology, creation, and the fall, and particularly questions of nature, grace, who is man, how did sin affect Adam, those kind of questions for our first big theme. And then what will flow from that is questions of reason, faith, epistemology, and the noetic effects of sin. And we'll kind of bring the discussion to a close as far as that theme with what Thomas does with Romans 1. And thankfully we have Thomas's commentary on Romans you can easily access. And it's a very fascinating read how he reads Romans 1. And so we'll hit that as our second main theme. Then if we have time, I'd like to cover some theological reflections for students wanting to study Thomas. So jump down there to 2/3 way through page 1. So anthropology, creation, and the fall. So one of the key issues in Thomas and appropriating Thomas is his classic line, which shows up in multiple places. Grace does not remove nature, but perfects it. And to understand that, we have to understand Thomas's understanding of anthropology, who is man, who was Adam in particular, as created, and then who was Adam after the fall. Now what you have in the notes is my attempt to work through, so for example, page 2 is really simply Thomas quoted. I've enumerated and spaced it for understanding purposes. So questions of what is the good of human nature, you have that part. And then at the bottom, I kind of repeat these things in an orderly way to try to make sense of them. Instead of reading through that, what I've done is on page 4, I have put all these into a table. And so look at page 4. And so when we think about Thomas, and I'm working just here mainly for now from his Summa Theologiae or Summa Theologica. Both titles show up in the literature, in the tradition. And evangelicals are criticized for not actually reading Thomas carefully. So I decided in preparing this talk to really try just to read Thomas, to understand him on his own terms. And so this is the first part of book 2. Okay, so if you see a capital 1 dash capital 2, Roman numeral 2 there, that's the first part of the second part of the Summa. And so let's look at here what the various goods of nature are. And what Thomas is doing is speaking of pre-fall Adam. Okay? So look at that chart on page 4, and I think you can begin to see how Thomas thinks. So there's three, if you'll think of three columns, first, second, third. He's got first, in that upper left-hand box, principles of which nature is constituted and the properties that flow from them, such as the powers of the soul and so forth. He will then, moving down the column, not across, but moving down, there's four main powers of the soul, at least in this part of the Summa: reason, will, irascible, and concupiscible. Now, real briefly, so reason, that's fairly easy to grasp. The intellect, the reason. The will, our affections, heart, etc. Irascible and concupiscible can be a little harder. Irascible, you might think of like the willingness to do hard things, fortitude. Now, concupiscible has to do with our desires and how they can either move in healthy or unhealthy, good or bad directions, okay? So if you'll think about those four: reason, will, irascible, concupiscible. Now, to grasp Thomas, reason is the chief of those, okay? Reason, in other words, reason allows us to rule over will, irascible, concupiscible. So for example, our reason can direct the will. Now, in a footnote, I note that other times Thomas seems to put the will first. That's kind of interesting, but we won't chase that for now. But certainly here, reason allows man to rule over his will and to rule over his fortitude, his willingness to take on difficult tasks, okay? To do tough things, we might say, difficult things. And the reason allows man to control his desires, okay? Now, if you keep moving down the column, that aspect of man, those powers of the soul, quote, are neither destroyed nor diminished by sin. So when evangelicals will think about Thomas on reason, one of our historic concerns has been, why wouldn't it be the case that original sin would hurt reason? Okay, and this is one of the classic critiques of Thomas by evangelicals. But wait for it, because Thomas is going to say something else in a second, which we need to take into account. Now look at the second column for a second, the natural inclination to virtue. If you move down to the very bottom, it's the last box. This is diminished by sin. It's not destroyed. It's not left alone entirely, but there is a diminishing, there is an effect of sin on the natural inclination to virtue. And so Thomas's argument is that we still have, even as fallen creatures, post-fall Adam and beyond, there is existing a natural inclination to virtue, and that is diminished but not destroyed. Now the very far right column, the third column, you have this gift of original justice or original righteousness, sometimes called the donum superadditum, or the superadded gift. And this is entirely destroyed by sin. This is this is probably one of at least many Reformed, particularly Protestants, critique is this whole concept of a superadded gift. And here's what Thomas will say, is reason itself is not hurt at all by sin. The faculty of reason is neither destroyed nor diminished by sin. But because we've lost the gift of original righteousness, that gift of original righteousness is what allowed pre-fall Adam, and presumably would have allowed him to continue, to use reason fully as one ought. So let me repeat that to make sure I'm being clear. Even though reason itself is neither destroyed nor diminished by sin, the loss of original justice or original righteousness or the superadded gift, we lost that with Adam's transgression. And it is that gift which allowed man, in a sense, to use reason in the fullest sense. So you might think of man's faculties, properties of the soul, powers of the soul: reason, will, irascible, concupiscible. Think of reason ruling over the rest. And what allows reason to do fully what it ought is this superadded gift. So we've lost the gift. So there is a loss of sorts that allows us to use reason as we ought. But reason itself, to quote Thomas, is neither destroyed nor diminished by sin. So look at the quote, please, at the bottom of the page. This is in 1.1, the first part of the second part, question 85, there at the bottom. I answer that as a result of original justice or righteousness, the reason had perfect hold over the lower parts of the soul, while reason itself was perfected by God and was subject to him. So God, of course, ruling over all. Now, this same original justice was forfeited through the sin of our first parent, Adam, so that all the powers of the soul are left, as it were, destitute of their proper order, whereby they are naturally directed to virtue, which destitution is called a wounding of nature. So here evangelicals want to be careful. If we say man's use of reason is in no way, shape, or form affected by sin, that wouldn't be quite correct. Reason itself is not diminished or hurt by sin. But having lost the gift of original righteousness, we might say that our ability to use reason in the fullest sense has been affected by the reality of sin. So look at a couple charts later on page 7. So I've given you more notes than I can read, and I've tabulated the text into a chart. So let's think for a second on page 7 of 4 areas or aspects of human nature. So we're back to reason, will, irascible, concupiscible. And, oh, by the way, trade secret. When a professor makes a table, it is not just so students can understand the material. It is so the professor can understand the material. So full confession there. So these 4 aspects of human nature. Notice what is the result from sin of each of these areas. It's very interesting to think about this. So look at reason. Reason, moving to the right, is deprived of its order to the true because of sin. And what is the wound? It's the wound of ignorance. That's worth thinking about, isn't it? Is that what we think is evangelicals, that sin does, just makes us ignorant? Perhaps. I suspect not. To the right, Thomas writes, this is a quote Thomas, the reason is obscured, especially in practical matters. As far as the will, right below it, where justice is, it's deprived of its order to the good. The wound is malice, and the will is hardened to evil. The irascible, so the subject of fortitude, it's deprived of its order to the arduous, to the difficult. The wound is weakness, and good actions become more difficult. The concupiscible, the subject of temperance, is deprived of its order to the desirable or delectable, moderated by reason. The result, the wound is concupiscence. And here Thomas seems to think of just, we might say, sinful desire. I don't think, when Augustine says concupiscence, at least in the final 2 works against Julian at the end of his life, Julian of Eclanum, it's almost always sexual disorder, desire with Augustine. I don't think that Thomas is necessarily speaking just of that. I'm open to being corrected. And then to the right there, concupiscence becomes more impetuous. Okay? Now, look at page 8. Here is, I'm going to skip over the 3 potential Protestant responses to Thomas on nature of grace at the top of the page. But that is, I covered this last night, so I just mentioned it there. We may return to that in the Q&A if you like. But here's my brief evangelical response before moving on to theme 2 to Thomas on his anthropology and particularly his understanding of how sin affects Adam. Number 1, Thomas's fascinating system moves him to try and hold together the idea that reason and will and irascible and concupiscible are in no way injured by original sin with, number two, the idea that the loss of original righteousness, or the donum superadditum, with number two, the idea that with the loss of this original righteousness, reason is not able, as it fully should, to operate as it ought, and so to direct those lower powers. I think this means that Thomas labors with a kind of both-and premise that seems unstable. On the one hand, reason is not injured in the least by sin. On the other hand, Adam lost original righteousness, the donum superadditum, by which Adam was able to rule over himself faithfully and rightly. This is why I think when you read, when an evangelical says, Thomas says this about reason is not affected by sin, a friend might say, well, here's this quote by Thomas where the use of reason is hampered. And both are kind of right. Reason itself is not harmed by sin in itself. The faculty is fully intact, neither diminished or lost by sin. But because of the loss of original righteousness, we might say man is not able to use reason in all the ways he fully should. Okay? Number two, flowing from the first point, we should also note that the notion that the donum superadditum was completely lost, while other aspects of Adam's human nature either were not really affected by sin or were only somewhat affected by sin, simply seems an unnecessary construction, which seems to be an imposition on the biblical material rather than something which flows from the biblical material. Okay? In other words, you have a beautiful system. And this is, I think, a temptation for theologians is, you might call it system fascination or something. You get so enthralled with the system, and you eventually have to step back and say, well, is the system true, right? Do I have to buy all the components of this system? Number three, compared to Thomas, and this is a big general statement, the biblical testimony certainly seems to paint a more dire picture of human sinfulness and what was lost in Adam's sin. The consistent language of being dead in our trespasses and sins, of being enslaved to sin, of being slaves of sin, of being an enemy of God, and biblical references there. Thomas's interesting anthropology simply seems in a different conceptual universe from the teachings of the apostle to the Gentiles. Now that's very quick through a lot of material, and there's more notes than I'm able to work through. Let's shift then to the second main theme on page 9 of the notes. When Protestants, so the question of reason, faith, epistemology, and the noetic effects of sin. Now, I'm going to skip to about halfway through the page there. Let's just kind of get Thomas's big picture position before us here. And this is actually from the Summa Contra Gentiles, some against the Gentiles or heathens and nations. Here's what Thomas writes, just under halfway down the page. There is a twofold mode of truth in what we profess about God. Some truths about God exceed all the ability of the human reason. Such is the truth that God is triune. But there are some truths which the natural reason also is able to reach. Such are that God exists, that he is one, and the like. And in fact, such truths about God have been proved demonstratively by the philosophers, guided by the light of natural reason. Okay? I mentioned last night, I find Summa Contra Gentiles easier to read than Summa Theologiae. And if you're just trying to get into Thomas, I loved reading the Contra Gentiles as far as just grasping Thomas. So you might start there if you're new to Thomas. So what do we have here? Number one, there's a twofold mode of truth in terms of what we can say, believe about God. And there's two modes or levels of truth. Truths about God which exceed all the ability of human reason. God is triune. So someone last night asked this question in the chat, and here's a text where I think it's clearly saying for Thomas, we do not get to the Trinity through the light of natural reason. But then there are truths which the natural reason is able to reach. God exists, he is one, etc. So Thomas is fascinating here because I read Chesterton when I first tried to grasp Thomas 25, 30 years ago, 35 years ago, whatever. G.K. Chesterton, his great little book on, it's not that little, his great book on Thomas, finally helped me to grasp it, is Thomas can look at motion, and starting with motion can move to there being one God, and then working out from that demonstratively can really, at least Thomas believes, he can get to all the classic attributes, at least the omnis and atemporality, unchanging, immutability, impassibility, etc. Not necessarily to Trinity, but to the classic attributes. Now, why does Thomas argue this way? Look at page 10. Why does Thomas, about a couple inches down page 10, why does Thomas argue in this way? At the very beginning of the Summa Theologiae, Thomas holds that the knowledge of God is not self-evident. And this is probably the point at which a traditional Protestant evangelical, our antennae are going to go up a little bit, right? We're going to say, well, is that how we should think theologically? Is it true that the knowledge of God is not self-evident? And this is quite clear at the very near the beginning of Summa Theologiae. Now, since the knowledge of God is not self-evident, there is the necessity of demonstrative knowledge. This is very important. Since we cannot know God's essence, we must argue demonstratively from effect to cause. And I'm going to suggest by the time we get to Romans 1 why we may not want to follow Thomas here. I'm not saying we shouldn't argue from effect to cause. I've enjoyed the work of Stephen Meyer, the intelligent design folks, and this is fun stuff. So I'm not saying we can't argue from effect to cause. I am suggesting that we may not have to follow the logic of why Thomas says that's how we must argue. Because what Thomas is going to say, or does say, we cannot know God's essence because we are not proportioned to God. But to get ahead of ourselves, if we are to see God, know God, see God face to face, 1 John 3, also 1 Corinthians 13:12, then we must become proportioned to God. And this is why you will see in Thomas, not just in Eastern Orthodoxy, but in Thomas, a version of divinization. Because if we're going to reach that face-to-face vision, we must be proportioned to God, which includes some form of divinization. I have a PhD student writing on this very point, which is, I hope he keeps at it and does good work. I think he will do good work. He certainly is capable of doing good work. In case you're listening to this, student, he'll do fine. And but the point is, and I give you a bunch of text there we can look at, is because we cannot know the essence of God, we must make a demonstrative argument from effect to cause. Now, if we're perceptive, we might say, is there a tertium quid? Is there a third way? Or is there another way to think about knowing besides knowing essences, which we can't know now because we're not proportioned to God, as Thomas sees it, and demonstrative arguments from effect to cause. And to repeat myself, I'm not against arguing effect to cause. I'm kind of a cake and eat it too guys at times. I'm happy to bring in lots of different ways of arguing in general. But let's shift to page 11. Let's shift to Paul, Thomas Aquinas, and Romans 1. I think if we look closely at what Thomas does in his look at Romans 1, we'll see why he's forced to say the things he is forced or seems forced to say when he reads and exegetes Romans 1. So Paul, in Romans 1, this is the middle of page 11, Paul argues this, and this is the 4 enumerated points there. I'm just quoting Romans 1 here. There's 4 things that Paul says here, 4 ways in which Paul says in Romans 1 that we really know God. Okay, so Romans 1, I start in verse 19 in the notes. For what can be known about God is plain to them. And the 4 underlined and bolded phrases are different ways that Paul says we really know God through the created order. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. Then he goes on, this is very important. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made, so they without excuse. There's our first 3. Then the 4th mention along these lines of knowing God. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. And I just mentioned in a footnote, if I were 25 again, wanting to do a PhD in biblical studies, I might consider what in the world does what does Paul mean by perceiving God in Romans 1:20? I'd like to write a biblical theology of knowledge. That's kind of my dream book when I can clear my desk, a biblical theology of knowledge. I think we should come to terms with perception in a Pauline sense. What does it mean to perceive God? If your system forces you to say it is impossible to perceive God, I think you should question the system. And because Paul's happy to say we perceive God. We'll see. Now let's look at Thomas on Romans 1, skipping from the bottom of 11 to the top of page 12. Notice the block quote at the top of page 12. This is quoting Thomas on Romans 1, and he writes this. Then when he, Paul says, for what can be known about God, he manifests what he has said, but in reverse order. For he first admits that wise men among the Gentiles knew the truth about God. Secondly, he shows that there was ungodliness and injustice among them, so that they were without excuse. Thirdly, that they have incurred God's wrath. There, at who knowing the justice of God. In regard to the first, he does 3 things. First, he shows what they knew about God. Secondly, from whom they obtained this knowledge. There, at for God has made it clear. Thirdly, how they obtained it. That is, dealing with invisible things. He continues. Now, notice just exactly how Thomas thinks here. First, therefore, he says, rightly do I say that they have suppressed the truth about God. For they did possess some true knowledge of God, because what is known about God, what can be known about God by men through reason, interesting, is manifest in them, is manifest to them from something in them, from an inner light. Now, skip a paragraph there. We will carry on, but it is worth noting that Thomas's gloss, I think, seems to elide over the heart of the passage, that God reveals himself efficaciously to man through the created order. This knowledge, this is me writing now, this knowledge is not necessarily first and foremost via reason, though I don't think reason is being disparaged here at all. And Paul says nothing about an inner light per se. Thomas then writes the following, therefore it should be noted that some things about God are entirely unknown to man in this life, namely what God is. Now my comment, to be fair, if by what God is, Thomas meant something like essence in the fullest sense of the word, one could sympathize with Thomas and should. But it is interesting to note that what Paul actually argues, Paul actually asserts that what God has revealed is his invisible attributes. We perceive them somehow through the created order. namely his eternal power, divine nature. These realities have been clearly perceived. Okay, next page. Now, for Thomas, though, here's the, let me tell you where I'm going, then I'll go there. As I read Thomas, and I hope this is clear in the selection, he has a difficulty in one sense saying with Paul that we perceive God or we know God. What Thomas is going to say is we can know that there is a God, but that's not quite what Paul is saying. Paul is saying we know God. So here's how one Reformed apologist speaks about this. One Reformed apologist speaks about the infallibility of general revelation. That is, God reveals himself through creation in such a way that it's impossible not to know God. And I think this is central to apologetics and Christian theology. When you meet someone on the street and they say they're an atheist, what should we say as evangelicals? I think we should say, you might say you are, but I don't think you are an atheist, right? Because as I read Paul, there are no atheists, right? God reveals himself efficaciously to all persons, and every person we ever encounter knows God because God has revealed himself through the created order. I don't think Paul is saying that we make demonstrative arguments from effects to cause and conclude there is, or almost assuredly, or assuredly is a God. God simply reveals himself. Now, how does Thomas say we know God? Thomas, top of page 13, a couple inches down, there's three ways. The way of causality, so classic stuff, from effect to cause. By way of excellence, sometimes by way of immanence, we move from this realm to the highest example of those, and that must be God. Or by way of negation, we negate and say what God is not. Okay, he's unchangeable, he's infinite, etc. Thomas, the chart below that, even said, this is really intriguing, he equates these three ways, negation, causality, excellence, to the three things that Paul speaks of: invisible things of God, eternal power, divinity. Now here's my point. Why does Thomas, when he gets to Romans 1, why does Thomas struggle to say with Paul that all persons simply know God because God has efficaciously revealed himself through the created order? The way I understand Thomas's, if you want to say, dilemma here is, if to know is to know essences, simply, and if we cannot know the essence of God, it seems like the only thing left in Thomas's apparatus is knowing from effect to cause. But what if Paul has his own metaphysic, epistemology, view of revelation, which might move us to rethink our philosophical presuppositions? So here on page 14, the 1 and the 2, then the metaphysics, epistemology, revelation in bold. While Thomas says we do not know what God is, Paul says we know God's invisible attributes, God's eternal power, and God's divine nature. Number 2, just as significantly, Thomas holds that sensible creatures simply are not proportioned representing the divine essence. Now here I'm offering my own constructive, I just kind of let it flow at this time of the paper, this moment. But we should ask, what metaphysic or view of creation and what view of human knowing, epistemology, and what view of revelation undergirds or is presupposed by Paul's writing? Let me ask this another way. If we start with Paul as an apostle who represents the risen Lord Jesus, what metaphysics, epistemology, and view of revelation is presupposed in his apostolic revelatory message? So, to flesh this out a bit, in terms of metaphysics, Paul seems to presuppose or believe that this world is a good world created by God, and that this world has the capacity to be a vehicle or means of divine revelation. So metaphysics here bumps up into epistemology and revelation. Simply put, the world is so structured and made such that it is able to be a means of God revealing himself and not simply that he exists. Epistemology. God has so structured persons who were made in the image of God such that persons can know God. This does not mean that persons know exhaustively, nor does this necessarily mean that persons know God's essence in the fullest sense. Calvin was cautious about this as well. But nonetheless, persons are structured to know God, not just to make arguments from effect to cause. Paul is happy to say that man, and here he's speaking of persons who are not converted, who have not received, it does not seem, the gospel message. These persons know God's invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature. Lastly, revelation. Paul seems to believe, presuppose, and this is utterly essential, no pun intended, that God has the ability to speak, to reveal himself. And here metaphysics, epistemology, and revelation all collude. A key question seems to be, has God created a world which is so structured and governed, a metaphysic, such that this world is a fitting means, vehicle of revelation, epistemology and revelation, such that men can have persons, can have true and real, if imperfect and impartial knowledge, epistemology of who God is. To preclude the possibility of such revelation because of an a priori commitment that a creature cannot, cannot know the essence of God, seems to use such a prior philosophical commitment to mute the God of Scripture. Now, what I do there in the last part is offer some very general theological reflections, and I'll just summarize these briefly. So as for some thoughts for students, for all of us, how we engage Thomas, I'd say be overly honest and fair. So, C.S. Lewis says in Mere Christianity, if you want to be original, simply tell the truth. You'll end up original, more often than not, and you'll also be telling the truth. Also, study primary sources for these talks, and this may be a longer project. I just sat in my porch and read a lot of Thomas. I read some secondary sources, but if you've trafficked in the world of books about Thomas, they're legion. They never end. They're always being written. And Thomas is not necessarily that difficult to understand. It can be quite a joy. Is that the best word? Quite a pleasure, joy to read him. But get into the primary sources. Number 3, be willing to learn, even from folks with whom you might largely disagree. I do find myself sharpened as I read Thomas. He is worth the time. But 4, be wary of system fascination. As I mentioned earlier, I think this is something of the challenge for academics and maybe PhD students, maybe those of us who've made it through the PhD and still involved in academics. When you read Thomas or Augustine or Kant or Hegel, you can kind of just get caught up in the system. It's a fascinating system. And it's worth stepping back and saying, I wonder if it's true, right? So it's a good question to ask. 5, here's just kind of words to students. I think you have to move from being a fan to being a critic of some sorts. So as we read a great thinker, there is a sense in which we engage them and we kind of fall in love with what they're doing. And that's almost a necessary stage, at least it has been for me, of being a student. And then you have to step back and again be something of a critic. Now 6, while there is good reason to resist or be cautious about Aristotle, it is insufficient to simply say that because something is Aristotelian, it is therefore wrong, right? Because Aristotle, Plato, etc. may have gotten a lot of things right. So it'd be inaccurate, unhelpful, etc. to say, well, it's Aristotelian, as if that kind of settles the question. Well, that's a logical non sequitur, because Aristotle, in God's common grace, may have gotten a lot of things right. But 7, one must make some very important principial or fundamental choices on the nature of metaphysics. And I'm going to read some of this. There is a current trend in the classical theism movement, and I've always taught essentially classical theism, to say essentially something like this: Plato and Aristotle provided something of the philosophical scaffolding for classical Christian theism to build its edifice. Therefore, to be faithful theologians, we need to recover the insights of Plato and Aristotle if we're going to do good theology. Now, there's a number of things which could be said here. For one, it is important for Protestant students to have a meaningful, we talked about this morning, Albert, to have a meaningful grasp of the history of Western philosophy. This is important, whether you're biblical studies, theology, church history, etc. At some point, if you're going to be in the academic world, you've got to know something of the contours of, I think, Western philosophy. But, and here's where the bugs come out of the rug, how one approaches, appropriates, criticizes, etc., the Western philosophical tradition is of vital importance. So this leads me to say, one must ask, does one, number one, essentially appropriate the Western philosophical tradition, early on essentially Plato and Aristotle, or does one essentially do the deep exegetical and theological work of asking a basic question? What philosophical principles emerge from a close study of Scripture? And I'm clearly advocating the latter part, right? Now, one might say the following. This is me just inventing this conversation. Well, I think that by common grace, Plato and Aristotle got most many things right, so I'm free to use them as I please. It's a good point. I would reply something along the following lines. It is best to go back and do the deep exegetical and theological work and see where we end up. If we arrive at our destination, we climb that mountain and we find Aristotle and Plato sitting there greeting us and saying to us, hey folks, welcome, glad you finally made it, well, so be it. In short, I think a case can be made that Scripture has its own metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics, and to take every thought captive, we should ask what metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics emerges from Scripture.